Alright, so today, guys, we're going to talk about the idea of social class in China. When we talk about social class in China, and really in any region of the world, it typically is going to look something like this, some sort of pyramidical structure. Whether we're talking sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, Europe, Latin America, it really doesn't matter. They're all going to end up looking somewhat like this. They have different names for different layers and different levels, but ultimately this is going to be the basic structure. India is really the only place in the world where they really never developed a system quite like this, but India's situation is somewhat unique. So as we look at this pyramidical structure, the reason that historians and sociologists like to look at these as a pyramidical concept is because at the bottom, down here at the bottom of this pyramid, we have the bulk of the population. That's the foundation. Without those people at the bottom of the pyramid will not stand. The people at the top are the very few percentage of the population that are going to be considered wealthy or powerful, pretty much in any civilization. Whether we're talking the Middle East, whether we're talking Europe, whether we're talking East Asia, this is a very common structure. It is different from region to region, country to country, but it is a very similar concept. So let's start talking about these ideas. So we're going to start off with the emperor and the royal family. They're, of course, at the top of this big honkin' pyramid. They're going to be the very small percentage of people that are at the top. Now understand, the emperor and the royal family, when I say very small percentage, it's still going to be 500, maybe 2,000 people, depending on how big the emperor's family is, because this is going to include all of the emperor's brothers and sisters. It's going to include all of his concubines. It's going to include all of his wives. Most emperors were married to 4 or 5 royal wives, typically for political reasons. And all of these situations are going to end up in a scenario that the emperor and the royal family are very wealthy and very powerful in China. They bring a lot to the table financially that the lower classes cannot. So these people are going to be at the top. Everybody below them supports them, and everybody must do their share to support them. So below them are the scholars and government officials. Now these are going to be people, after the Han Dynasty, these are going to be people who do well on the exams. These are going to be the people that earn the spot. Before the Han Dynasty in ancient China, we're going to see these people be cousins, uncles, brothers of wealthy landowners of the royal family. But as time goes on and we get into the more traditional middle part of Chinese dynastic rule, we're going to see these jobs go to those who actually have skills. They're going to be positions that go to the people that actually have some skills based on how they do on those government exams. These are going to be the people who help the emperor run the country. Not so much like the head of the military and those kinds of things, but these are going to be political advisors who help him write laws, who help him collect taxes, and not so much like go door to door and collect taxes, but make plans to collect taxes. The army is going to be the one that goes door to door to collect taxes if they have to, or to enforce tax laws. Below the scholars and government officials are probably the most important people in traditional China, and that's going to be the gentry. The gentry are landlords. That's what they called them in Europe, lords. In China we call them gentry. In Japan we call them daimyo. Every country has these people. These are the wealthy landowning rich of any country, any civilization. In China they are just simply called the gentry. These people own the bulk of the land. These people run their land. These people are the ones who have contact with the peasants. The peasants do what the gentry tell them. The gentry do what the scholars and government officials tell them. The government officials do what the emperor tells them, and so on and so forth. So the gentry are the ones who are kind of in the trenches. So if you think about it like in the United States, the gentry would be the equivalent of, say, governors or county commissioners, people who are going to be able to manage lots of people in a very small area. So these guys are going to be a really important group. And what makes them important is because they are kind of the go-between between the emperor and the peasants. They're the ones that kind of mitigate problems. They handle most of the decisions that happen on their land. If there's a law broken, the gentry are the ones who decide the punishment, because that's on that local level. Now, if a gentry violates a law against another gentry, then that's going to go to a government official, a scholar, or the emperor to decide that case. It just kind of depends upon the situation. But certainly, if there's something that happens on the land of a gentry, then the gentryman is going to decide the fate of what happens there. So the reason this dashed line is there is because those three groups make up what we call the upper class of China. Now, for most of China's history, this is going to be somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population. This is not a big chunk of the population. It's 10 to 15% of the population, 10 to 15% of the people, of the 500 million people, 200 million people, depending on what part of China's history we're talking about. That's going to be who makes up who this gentry is. Below the gentry are going to be the peasants. All right, the peasants make up 80% of the population, and the reason I put the dashed line there will be evident here shortly. The peasants are going to be the bulk of the population of China. They're going to be the people who are working the land. Joe Schmo walking down the street, your average everyday ho-hum Chinese guy, he is going to be the guy who is a peasant. He's going to be the one who works the land. He's going to be the one who obeys the laws of the gentrymen to obey the laws of the scholars obey the decrees by the emperor, and so on and so forth. So these peasants, really the whole system is predicated upon them, because all of the people from this point above, this is why the second dashed line is there, all of these people from this point up are tied to the land. They are considered important because they are tied to the land. This line right here, this top dashed line, those people that are above that are considered upper class. Peasants are considered lower class. But because peasants deal with the land, they actually are considered semi-important to Chinese culture and society. They are actually deemed to be somewhat important. These people down here, we'll talk about here very shortly, they are not important because they do things that are not tied to the land. So when you think of this pyramid, think of the pyramid as symbolic of land in China. That the more of these pyramids you can see, and the more of these scenarios that you can see, then the more structure that it's going to have. So these peasants, they are the foundation of all of Chinese society. All of Chinese civilization is based on the fact that these peasants are going to work the land, that they're going to live on the land that they've lived on for 700 years, 1,000 years, and they're going to work the land and pay taxes and all of those things. And we'll talk about the taxes here in a minute. Our artisans and merchants are actually considered lower class. The peasants are lower class, but so are artisans and merchants. Now we're talking blacksmiths, we're talking carpenters, we're talking anyone who has a skill that isn't related to the land. So if I'm a farmer, I need a plow. An artisan is going to make me the plow. That artisan is considered lower class. That's why he's below that dashed line. An artisan is considered lower class, and they are actually considered by society to have less value than a peasant. Now, there are not as many artisans as there are peasants, and really before long these artisans and peasants will switch spots. The artisans will slide up here and the peasants will be down here, but that won't happen until probably the 16 or 1700s in China, so it's going to be 1,000 years before that changes. Our merchants are not considered important at all to China. Oddly enough, though, China would not have been a wealthy, powerful, prominent nation without the merchants. But because the merchants and the artisans have nothing to do with land, they don't do anything with land, they don't work the land, they don't own the land, they don't protect the land, all they do is work for money, they were deemed lower class and not worthy of being in the upper classes in China. In other civilizations, they were considered upper class. Now understand, lower class is not an economic classification in Japan. Merchants could be filthy rich. Artisans could be extremely wealthy. But they were still considered socially less than peasants, gentry, scholars, etc. Then we have our soldiers. Now our soldiers are kind of, the reason we put them on the very, very bottom of the pyramid is because without the soldiers, the society can't exist. The soldiers are the police force. They enforce laws. The soldiers protect the country from foreign invasion. The soldiers do a lot of really important things for China. Without the soldiers, the entire system would fail. But, again, much like the artisans and the merchants, the soldiers have nothing to do with land ownership. They don't own anything, they don't work the land, all they do is protect it. And if you think about it, in traditional China, Having soldiers, having a large army. Think about Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. They talked about this in the video. He had a very large army to help protect China and to make him look powerful and strong. That's great. The problem is an army doesn't produce anything. They don't make you money. They don't. All they do is cost you money because you have to feed them. You got to put them in uniforms. You got to give them weapons, and they're very, very, very expensive. So you really don't want a big army, but you have to have a big army in order to show your dominance as a dynasty. So the soldiers were considered a necessary evil in traditional China, not something that anybody wanted, but something that people had to have. And so these groups really kind of make up the bulk of the population of China. Now, over time, we started to see a new group get added to this population, and that's going to be the slaves. The slaves are going to be the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the barrel. These are going to be peasants conquered from other kingdoms. These are going to be people who have lost their social status in life. They have no value other than the fact that they are cheap labor. And when I say cheap, I mean free. You barely have to feed them. You barely have to clothe them. If they die, you're not that distraught because there's another one right over there that looks just like them. The idea of a slave, slaves are considered less than peasants because peasants get mad at slaves because they're too lazy. Again, slaves were more of a product of war, not so much, it wasn't chattel slavery like we saw of black African slaves during American colonial days. We're talking the idea of slavery, taking prisoners from a conquered people, somebody that we conquer, somebody that we take advantage of, that they really kind of go from there. So that really is kind of the key there for the slaves. Now, actually, outside of the system, there's one more group, totally outside the system, totally not even related to the system, because it really shows the emphasis that China puts on this, and that's going to be, whoops, I guess we're going to get to them later. So, in our feudal system, what happens is we have dollars that go up. These dollars that go up are called taxes. Soldiers don't have to pay taxes. Artisans, merchants, peasants, gentry, they all have to pay taxes. Taxes go up. Everybody pays taxes up to the emperor. That way the emperor ends up with a whole ton of money. And all of that money goes into the emperor's coffers. And the emperor can do whatever he wants with it. Now, any emperor worth his salt is going to save up that money, and he's going to have crops and rations saved up in case there's a flood or a famine. Any emperor worth his salt is going to have a strong army to help protect his people. Now, in exchange for that taxation, people get protection. In the traditional world, think about Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. Why did he build the Great Wall? To protect people. Well, it also did have a double purpose that he could now generate more money from taxes by building said wall. So when we talk about the increase of taxes, we talk about the decrease of protection. In exchange for taxes, people get protection, and they're extremely excited about that. Then, of course, we have the people at the very, 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 very bottom of society, and that's going to be our women. In traditional China, women had no real value. Women served one purpose. And that purpose was to have babies. And not even just to have babies, but to have baby boys. So when we talk about the role of women, they are almost totally excluded from all this feudal system. Now understand, if I am the wife of a gentryman, I am not below a peasant. But I have no real value to society, and I don't really own anything. If my husband dies, if I'm the wife of a gentry, if my husband dies, all of his property goes to our son, our oldest son. All the other sons, they're out of luck. Hopefully the oldest son will take care of them. Now, any good son, as we follow traditional Confucian laws and traditions, is going to take care of his mother because he's going to respect his elders and take care of his mother because that is the expectation. So women are excluded from the system, but understand, gentry women they weren't considered less than peasants or less than artisans and merchants. So compared to what you read about yesterday for yesterday's homework, this is obviously a much more complex system. And as we talk about China, as we talk about Japan, as we talk about Korea, as we talk about every civilization on planet, we see that this system kind of rears its ugly head over and over and over again. And time after time, countries, civilizations, regions come up with this system. We'll talk about this a little bit more on Friday. I'm running out of time on my presentation because I only have 15 minutes. Have a nice day. Nah, it's